So let's get started. We have a great panel discussion about how the open source community, government agencies, and standards organizations are working to improve cybersecurity. I will let the speakers introduce themselves. Speakers, we have 4 mics, 5 chairs. So we're going to be friends today, and whoever's at the end, please share with your neighbor. I would like to please welcome Sanchiko Moto, Jeff Borick, Sarah Evans, Krob, and Nithya Ruff to the stage. And woo! Yeah, there you go. Wake up, wake up. Anybody? There's some slides after this. I don't know if anybody.
Okay. So I get to be moderator of this panel, so I get to ask all the tough questions, but have no answers to all of those questions because these folks, good folks, know the answers. So with that in mind, let me turn it over to you, Sachiko, to please introduce yourself.
I knew I shouldn't have sat here. Yes, hello everyone. I'm Sachiko. I'm the chair of an organization called Open Forum Europe. I'm also a senior researcher at Sweden's National Research Institute called RISE.
And I'm Jeff Borick. I work for IBM, and I've been working in and around open source for about half my career, over a decade now. And I work specifically in the area of open source compliance and in the office of the CISO.
Hi, I'm Sarah Evans. I'm with Dell Technologies. My background is in IT and security. I got into open source 2 years ago when I was asked to be the observer to the governing board member, and currently I work in the office of the CTO doing security R&D, and so getting a chance to understand and work more with software developers and the open source community has been really wonderful. I'm leaning in, and I'm glad to be here today to talk about this topic.
I've been doing upstream open source security for about a decade, and I work at Intel as a director of security communications. I am the facilitator for the best practices working group, the vulnerability disclosures working group. I'm the big brother to the end user working group. I work on the public policy committee, the governance committee, and I am the chairperson of the TAC. Well, the best working group obviously is the best, but I love them all.
So Crow has a thing for hats, I see.
I also like hats.
I was going to say something too.
Yeah.
It's my first Open SSF day, so that's the famous
No,
hat?
no.
No, oh no.
That's not it.
The goose couldn't make it in my luggage and allow me to hit the weight limit.
It is beautiful, a thing of beauty for sure. Easily mistaken for tux or honk.
It's not the hunting
Sorry.
season,
Yes,
I hope.
exactly. So I'm Nithya Ruff, and I don't actively work in the Open SSF task force or the governing board, but I work in the open source program office at Amazon, and we work very, very closely with our CISO office, as well as with the policy folks at the company, as well as the people who implement the software supply chain inside the company. So I have a great deal of interest in this topic, and Jeff invited me, so I said, okay, I'll be here. I wanted to turn it over to Jeff first to kind of introduce the topic itself, because Jeff was kind enough to put this panel together in the abstract and assemble this distinguished panel, and wanted to get his perspectives on what he wanted to convey in this panel.
Well, thanks. I have to live up to that now. So, no, I'm actually very proud to be active in this space, because it was about 5 years ago that I started to lose sleep at night, because you could see the escalation of open source being consumed in the supply chain. And even in a large company like IBM, I work, part of my responsibilities was focused specifically on helping to manage the legal risk. And yet, because about 10 years ago, open source was now then 10 years old, the decision was kind of made, well, nothing really too bad has happened. We'll still monitor and manage the legal risk, but the quality/security risk, we'll let the various business units decide for themselves and do their own quality reviews. And when you distribute something that important across a large matrixed organization, you end up with distributed results. And that's all I'll say about that. But the other thing that I think is fascinating about this space is that the interplay between trying to protect yourself from a cybersecurity perspective and trying to be compliant with the regulations and rules of the industry. And if you really start to peel that back, you realize, it involves so many different stakeholders across your organization. They all come at this from different perspectives. So it's the old, axiom of the, 6 individuals touching an elephant in a dark room, and they all describe something completely different, right? So you can end up with an organization that's completely compliant, but a high cybersecurity risk, or you can be very well protected and not at all compliant. And so it's not surprising that we've got a lot of work cut out for us.
Well said. So with that, I'd like to start with a bunch of questions that we prepared, and then towards the end, go to the audience for questions. So please start thinking about all those tough questions you want to ask this panel. And we'll have about 15, 20 minutes for that. So Sachiko, what do you think about the increasing number of regulations like the CRA and its impact on open source security? Why is there so much interest?
What do I think about it? How do I feel about it? I think that, I think at dinner last night I sensed a certain level of fatigue around the CRA, but I think we have to have the discussion, obviously, and I think I should have mentioned also a bit of my background, because I've spent 15 years in sort of Brussels policy environment, and so I have a political science background, and I feel like I can come to events like this and have a little bit of a, even though I've been sort of within the open source sort of bubble, I can still give a different perspective, because I think that the discussions around CRA especially, there is a sense, I think, sometimes in the open source community that this is sort of targeting open source development sort of specifically and explicitly. And this, is clearly not the case. It's not a good piece of legislation, but the intent is not to kill open source development. It's based on the fact that I think European legislators don't have a good idea of, they don't understand this term that you mentioned, the sort of software supply chain, and they don't understand fully the value of open source either. So even now, if you come and speak to policymakers, for example, and you bring up some problems, I think to some extent they're going to be sympathetic, but they're going to say, so what? We are having an objective of protecting European citizens, consumers, and open source development, yeah, that sounds very nice, innovation, collaboration, but there are some higher values at stake here. So I think the issue is, and that I've been trying to sort of put forward at events like this, is that we as sort of like open source community and organizations that are active in this space, there is a massive educational and campaign that needs to happen, because what we are engaging in right now is only to try to limit the damage. We cannot have the CRA will, I think, come into effect. It will be adopted. What we don't see here is that actually there is a lot of support for this piece of legislation. It has actually been fast-tracked. The policy process, the legislative process is being fast-tracked right now because the main political institutions are more or less in agreement, which is not always the case. There are many pieces of legislation in Brussels where the Parliament, there's a lot of controversy around the legislation, but here there's a lot of support for it. So the next time round, we need to get in there, and it needs to be a piece of legislation that is written originally with a better understanding of how software is developed and distributed in today's world. I don't know.
It's a really good point that the European Union is rallying around protection of citizens, and so they all agree, and so it's moving really with really haste, and so it's really incumbent upon all of us to start developing frameworks for how do we implement this or how do we support this.
Yeah, and what you said, the language is very important.
Yes.
Right? Even when you use consumers, when we talk about the CRA contains a lot of language that is new to this community, but actually has a lot of history in the European Union context. So when you say consumer, when you say placing something on the market, or a lot of these things have a lot of history. It's been used with success to introduce, consumer safety and environmental protection regulations. And so I think that the European Union, they feel like, okay, we have finally managed to somehow extend this to sort of to the digital reality that we live in now. And so we have an uphill battle.
And success with getting Apple to change their power cord has emboldened them to do great things.
And the GDPR. I think,
Any other comments from the rest of the panel on CRA different perspectives?
I agree with everything Sachiko said, and this is not a U.S.-only concern or an EU-only concern. We're monitoring legislation around the globe in Japan, Germany, Britain. There are governments in general are interested in protecting all of their constituents, and some of them are more vocal about the particulars around open source than others. And I agree that the CRA is an interesting learning experience. I wish we would have had some more opportunity to help educate.
And I'd also, I don't know, is this on? Test? Okay. So there is an effort right now in the OpenSSF to put together something called an MVSR, which stands for Mission, Values, or Vision, Roadmap, and Strategy. I may have interposed some of the acronyms there. But what's really interesting is that as we've gone through that exercise of creating it, there is a key objective that the OpenSSF wants to accomplish as part of a strategic goal, and that is for policy and advocacy. And so as we're putting on our roadmap, what are the important components that we want to look at over the next year and a half related to that? I think it's going to be important that we include things from international components, US, EU, and other locations.
Yeah, I mean, OpenSSF is where we all kind of look to for frameworks and for standards and tools, and so that would be very helpful. Jeff, anything else to add to on the CRA side? No? The second question I wanted to ask all of you is, clearly the software supply chain is made up of so many different players. You have security experts, you have government experts, you have legal, you have open source developers, you have companies, etc. How do we all work together and create a common purpose and a common language across us to ensure that we have a secure supply chain? And Sarah, I know this is very near and dear to your heart, so you want to kick that off?
Yes, that'd be great. So one of the things that I love about my role in security is bringing together stakeholders that don't always share the same perspective. They may make different risk-based decisions. They may be economically incentivized in different ways. And so to bring multiple stakeholders together that don't normally interact together to accomplish a common goal is no small feat. Whether we're talking about open source security or we're talking about business. But one of the things that I love is a good story. And so the story that I think best describes this, for me, this challenge is the parable of stone soup, or as Sachiko is saying, sometimes nail soup. So the villagers are hungry, and someone comes into the city square, puts a huge pot of water on a fire and starts to boil it, and drops into the pot of water a couple of stones. And the hungry villagers come out and they look at the center and they say, "You are boiling a pot of water with a rock in it." And he said, "What is this?" "Well, this is dinner tonight." And so the villagers are like, I don't know how this is going to work out. I don't think it's going to taste very good, so I'll bring what I have to try and help make this soup taste better. So one of the villagers goes back, gets a couple of carrots. Another villager goes back, I don't have much, but I have a couple of potatoes. And so on until at the end of the day, the soup is finished and they all eat this, rich vegetable soup that they wouldn't normally have been able to eat unless they all came together and brought the specific skill, or in this case, the specific ingredient that they had to make it work. So when we talk about that in a simplified way, I like that because it talks about bringing what you have. We don't need all carrots. We don't need all potatoes. We need the skill that those different people have, which requires empathy. And so when you're talking to a government official or a computer programmer or software developer, if you're talking to a security person or business person, someone in open source, we all have different skill sets. And we all have different things we bring to the table, but we need to do that with empathy, and we need to do that with our common goal in mind, which is improving open source security.
I was teasing Sarah yesterday, saying that, okay, that's very sort of, I tend to see the glass more as half empty. So it's more like the too many chefs, or lowest common denominator can also be an outcome, right? And I think that, even talking about fragmentation, I think that we have the potential of coming together and doing this, but everybody knows how difficult that is in practice. And sometimes, I think we may sort of complain about regulatory pressure, but I think sometimes the positive outcome of regulatory pressure is that an industry realizes that, you have to come together. Otherwise, you'll face, a regulatory burden. And so you have to come together and take responsibility as an industry together.
It's a real mark of maturity and importance that very important people in suits and granite buildings find open source interesting officially now. So that's yay us, open source one. But that also requires us to grow up a little bit. And Sarah mentioned the MVSR. One of the components of that is we're talking about an assortment of personas that foundation-wide we're trying to address. And many of the working groups had used personas to understand the stakeholders that they're trying to address, SALSA and the end user group and vulnerability disclosure group. But now, as part of a cross-foundation effort, we're crafting different lenses of users and use cases we're trying to address. And like this morning, Nithya's presentation, I found 2 more that I need to add. I need to officially add in public policy folks, governments, and then think more about the commercial supplier, which we have that. It was more generic around just supplier, and I think we could be more precise. But that's something that, as we collect our thoughts and understand these different constituents and partners we need to work with, we can form a playbook. And for example, if we're talking about public policy and government regulators, we can put down some ideas of, we need to convey this information, and here are mechanisms with which we can execute on that and provide those folks education to help them understand. So as they're crafting important legislation, they at least come at it from a point of education and understanding first.
And then one last point I'd tag along to that thread is that one of the things I think that pretty much everyone in this room is fairly aware of is that open source is a lot more of a complex ecosystem than busy government regulators and other executives have time to deal with, right? I sometimes use the metaphor of it's like a crystal vase. If someone sees it across the room, they kind of know what it is, but it isn't until you actually pick it up and hold it up to the light and turn it around and see all the facets that are contained in this ecosystem that you start to realize, wow, this is a lot more than just, hey, free software. And on a positive note, I would say that when this first meeting in DC about a year and a half ago occurred, the regulators at that meeting were coming at it from a, wow, this open source thing is a mess, and what are you going to do to fix this type of thing? And the most recent meeting that we had just last week that Amkar talked about, they came with much more of an understanding that, wow, open source really is this engine of innovation, and it really is driving value, not just for the private sector, but also for the public sector. And they had representatives from middle management of like DSHS, their health division, their Office of Management and Budget. So several of the government verticals were there testifying to the fact that they're getting value out of this, and they're starting to try and think, how are we going to contribute back to help?
If I can, still on that question, a bit linking to what both Krob and Sarah, and I think, also linking back to your talk this morning, when you talked about the sort of, I think if we're going to communicate with legislators about complex issues, we have to find very strong narratives and analogies. And the thing about the Twinkies and the what's in the food that you eat, but you can take that, that can be extended, because also in Europe we have strong food safety legislation, and the supply chain applies there as well, and where the different economic operators and their responsibilities are spelled out and listed. And of course there we have to understand a bit, because of course there is a specific responsibility on sort of the retailer, but for each actor in the supply chain there are responsibilities. And I think we need to come up with these models and also be able to refer to maybe areas that the regular policymakers, and I often say this, we have 700 plus legislators in the European Parliament, and they cover all issues, like the protection of sea life one day, and then the next day, fire safety regulation. They don't have, they need to be able to grasp something quite quickly, and I think, they're finding those ways to communicate, and I think there are analogies there too. Like, of course, if a chicken leaves the farm, there needs to be a way to trace, and and there are responsibilities for, like, okay, it cannot leave without, with salmonella or something, whatever, like a certain level of bacteria. But of course, then how the chicken is then stored cannot be the responsibility of the farmer, right? So there is an analogy there, and I think we have to work a little bit to be able to have that conversation with policymakers.
So build on what they may already know. I think you're bringing up some really good points. One is they have to work on such a broad set of topics that working on a story that resonates with them will help them understand this better, rather than saying, come on, man, you've got to understand open source is different, and it's unique. And but you also brought up an important point, which is the end objective we all have is that the world is safer, citizens are safer, products are safer. No company, no open source developer wants the responsibility of something going wrong. So perhaps working backwards from a common objective really helps us unify, our intent, if you will, and our role in that security story. Let me also say it would be nice, as you're developing the personas, Crow, to kind of create a taxonomy of all of these different players and what they do, what their capabilities are, and so on and so forth, right? Yeah.
We're starting some of that. Patches are always welcome.
Yes. Yes,
I need
exactly.
to have a look at that, because you talk here a lot about the government as a regulator, but we tend to look at government as sort of, there's the regulation aspect, there's as a big funder of research, and that's very important in the European context, where almost all of the sort of the big research that goes on in universities, but also with industry partners, is funded by the European Commission, and it needs to. There are also criteria for, they steer the direction of the research. So there's the regulator, there's the funder of research, and there's also public procurement.
That's right.
Where there's also a lot of power in that. So,
Yeah. So the next question is, what's the role of the supplier in ensuring that the components they consume and supply are secure? We think that the onus should be on suppliers and not on independent open source providers, right? That's kind of the common theme and concern around CRA. So Jeff, I know you're very passionate about this question, so you want to get us started on that?
The real challenge again is that collectively we can't punish the individual open source developer. Open source development is a digital public good in today's society, and yet it remains a huge challenge. It's something that Linux Foundation and other organizations have been trying to address, not just in the last 12 months, but the last 12 to 20 plus years now. And it's going to remain challenging in terms of how we support developers. And given that, heavens, we don't want to persecute them. And so we want to help, again, progress the industry towards an understanding that, sure, open source is a digital public good. Not all open source is created equal. We need to help come up with tools and metrics to help shine a light on what open source is critical and try to help explore where some of the weak links in the chain still exist. And the other thing I'll say about the GDPR topic is that when you really look at this, it's a journey for Europe, and it's going to be a journey again for our friends in Asia Pacific as well. And I'm very optimistic that the right thing is going to come together, but it isn't going to happen unless we all proactively lean in to help make it happen. Because, again, I cited earlier the progress I saw in DC in the point of view, and I think that's a reasonable objective to expect if we all collaborate with both the EU and in Asia Pacific.
I personally have a somewhat spicy take on this in certain circles that we travel in. It's Kroeb's personal opinion. If you sell something to someone for money, a platform or a service, you have certain obligations to those customers. And if you are relying upon free and open source software to make money, you probably should, it's in your best interest to invest in that software and that community and those developers so that they can be successful by providing training or contributors or infrastructure or whatever assistance that community needs. So I feel that's my personal moral obligation. Some others may feel differently, but they're wrong.
And that leads me, it is a perfect segue into what I wanted to say. But one of the things that's just great about the OpenSSF is that it's bringing together these stakeholders of different areas that can talk about what should good look like. So I am from Dell. We are a consumer of open source. And so as a result of our participation in OpenSSF, I also have access to talk to different stakeholders across my company and say, how do we need to play an industry leadership role in the open source that we are contributing? How do we want to get out and strategically contribute to help make the open source that we consume the open source that the world deserves? And so I think that it's just fantastic to have these gathering of developers, enterprises, governments, a nonprofit foundation that's all coming together to talk about what's the right thing to do and how can we all do it together.
So to your question, I think it's my firm belief that the European legislator had in mind that it would be sort of that the responsibility would be on the actor that puts something on the market for. And when they use consumer, I mean, I hear we use here in open source, talking about consuming open source and things like that. Consumer in the European, policy context means an individual consumer. That's why the CRA says consumers and businesses that use, for example. So it's clear that this legislation was aimed to protect the consumer that, buys a product. And even they talk about a CE marking, they had in mind something physical, which has a digital component inside, and which something you can put a mark on it. They had in mind, and they mentioned the manufacturer, the importer, and and sometimes a distributor. Then, of course, when you start to have the conversation and you show them the complexity, I think they will say, well, yes, of course, that person, those should also be responsible. And I think that they're a little bit grasping at sort of understanding the complexity and making sure that nobody's off the hook, let's say. But it's clear that the intent was not to hit, for sure not the individual developer or even the development process. And I think they did not have in mind also that, publishing code on GitHub, that was equivalent to putting something on the market. Mm-hmm. They struggle with this term commercial, monetary, things like that, because, and I was just saying this the other day, if my bank publishes an app and tells me to install it, they're not selling that to me. They're not making money off of, distributing that app. But of course, from the regulator point of view, this should still be in scope. Somebody is like making it available for an individual consumer, almost sort of encouraging them to install it on their phone. This should be in scope. And I think right now we have a problem, like I said, it was drafted initially, not understanding how the market works. I do think that it was not intended to hurt development or the individual developer. Now the text, I'm not sure that there's enough willingness from them to really also fix it. You see what I mean? Because they don't understand the extent of the problem. So we are stuck with this,
Yeah. I think that was the initial kind of outrage and reaction, right, to the CRA was, oh my goodness, this one maintainer who's spending 2 hours every weekend maintaining this component, he or she does not have the bandwidth nor the money, the wherewithal to comply, and to be, forced to pay fines and forced to comply can kill the industry. People will walk away from it and won't do.
But this will not happen. On the other hand, it's clear that, for example, in the actors that you mentioned, curator,
Yes.
that's
Yeah.
probably in scope.
Yeah.
Then the foundations, that's where it kind of a little bit, I think.
And
yes, no. But what I'm saying, this is what's at risk.
Yeah.
That this will be some responsibility will fall on foundations and even code repositories, things like that. The individual, this is, it's not realistic to say that that anybody would go after like an individual developer.
Yeah.
That's just, but the risk to open source development is real enough that we don't have to go to the extent where we say, they're gonna like go after some person who's doing this out of their own, in their own spare time, etc.
5 minutes? Ooh. Oh, wow. Gosh. So any questions from the audience? Yes, please. Speak loud enough.
I'll repeat the question.
Yes.
G'day. Probably a question for you, Sachiko. It's blowing my mind. I'm from Australia. We have legislation there too and stuff.
You're in the Eurovision too, so.
Yeah, crazy. It's blowing my mind that what I'm hearing here is that this legislation is yet to be enacted. There's vocal feedback that it's flawed, and the legislative body seems to be plowing ahead regardless. That doesn't compute.
Yes, because we think we're loud, but maybe not. To say loud enough is not the point. The point is that in Europe, we have familiar brand names, big companies that are in, I don't want to mention necessarily, but like, Bosch, Ericsson, but like, everybody, Electrolux in Sweden, whatever. Those companies are pretty much, they're not getting feedback from sort of industrial giants that this is going to be a problem. And I think they are hearing this voice quite loudly, but I don't think that it may not be enough, because every legislation, let's be clear, every piece of legislation will make some people unhappy. And so if you're just sitting there as a legislator, you're saying, okay, well, I'm not hearing, the usual suspects are not coming to me saying this is going to kill off European industry, and things like that, which they might if you have something like, something around emissions or something like that. You'll have like the car industry every time saying you're going to kill the European car industry. They're used to this. If they hear, okay, some people are not happy, but how important are those people? They have not understood, the extent to which, the world already relies on open source, and also the opportunity and the risk that if Europe cannot sort of leverage open innovation, open source, that we'll fall behind. This has not been comprehended enough. That's
So
the answer.
European companies in the audience, have you heard that? Please make sure you're...
Well, the other thing I'll jump in
Yes.
real quick and pragmatically say is that with this legislation pending, if they don't enact it and the next Log4j happens, then the hairy finger of guilt is going to be pointed at the EU regulators. So they'd rather go forward with something flawed and have a coverage.
I get that. It seems like there's a lot of positive EU legislation that's done global knock-on effect good, right? I look at the other one I look at is whatever the cookie legislation is, which is like the California Prop 65 of the internet. It's horrendous. It seems like when it comes to software and internet stuff, the legislature doesn't seem to get it.
Yeah, they're not software developers for sure.
I think there's another question in the audience here.
And I'll just encourage folks to kind of go into lightning round mode. We're going to run out of time, but I saw several hands.
This gentleman right here in the middle, I think, had a question. No? Okay. Go for it.
No, I just wanted to add on to what Jeff said. In the documents that is behind CRA, it says very clearly that the cost for society of all these cyber problems is way too high. And by pushing the responsibility to the vendors, the cost for consumers will be a bit higher. The vendors, the text really says, you have to prioritize cybersecurity before new features. So the idea is really good. The whole open source mess is a mess that was happening by mistake. And I hope you're right that nothing bad will come out of this. But that people are not going to hunt open source developers down. But I'm really afraid of the open source part. But this will happen, and we have to prepare for it.
So if I may throw it to Rob Krob, and we'll go down the
Can we
list
go
here
one
for just
extra minute? Because this is such an important topic.
closing remarks, starting this way, going.
If you work for a company that has public policy people, I would encourage them to educate themselves on the global open source regime of things and to participate where they can, especially if you're like a major manufacturer in the EU that holds a lot of sway with the parliamentarians.
I would add to that, the OpenSSF is a collective voice that we can use to bring many pieces of this conversation together. So participate and make your voice heard, and then we can use that collective voice that the OpenSSF has with our different personas and our different interactions with the other parts of the industry.
Yeah, and I would just echo that we really do need your help. I'll take it back to my opening comments that,
Patch is welcome.
Cybersecurity, we all don't want to get ripped off. And compliance, no one wants to go to jail. And those things are not necessarily complementary in a complex environment like we all talked about today. So it's going to take time, and it's going to take every one of us leaning in to help fix this problem.
I'll echo Krob there and say that we need to have those conversations, not just the people here to take their responsibility, but the public policy people. And so that needs to come from maybe from the organization and be fed to those people sitting in Brussels and who have conversations with policymakers every day. This needs to be an ongoing conversation that they're having, not just, you know, to try to fix something at the 11th hour.
Thank you so much, Sachiko. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Crow. And thank you, everyone, for listening to a very important topic. Take care.
Yay.
High fives. All